Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Solidarity Podcast. Through these podcast episodes, I aim to offer further analysis and theoretical backing to the videos I make for my YouTube channel, as well as issues that are going around the world. So let's dig in. Up until a decade ago, many of the issues we're again facing seemed like won victories. Trends of racism and sexism were on the decline, and it seemed that every day we were approaching a more understanding, tolerant, and equal society. All of that is in the trash now. With the rise of right-wing figures such as Trump, Meloni, the AfD in Germany, or Earth Wilders, we not only see a massive return of racist rhetoric to the mainstream political discourse, but also a dehumanization of a group of people not seen since the days of the Nazis. Same can be said about women's rights as well, especially in the US. All this while globalized capitalism claims to advocate for universality of rights and a strict meritocracy. There seems to exist a paradoxical relationship between universalism, racism, and sexism in the modern world. In this podcast, I will use the works of Dr. Wallerstein and Dr. Federici to explain this. While universalist doctrines rooted in Enlightenment thought and monotheistic traditions emphasize equality and human rights, they coexist with structural racism, sexism, as well as homophobia, which contradict these ideals. Wallerstein argues that this contradiction is not a temporary flaw, but a fundamental feature of the capitalist system, which relies on both meritocratic ideology and hierarchical divisions to sustain itself. In past historical systems, maintaining consistency was easier. Despite their differences in structure and underlying principles, these systems consistently made moral and political distinctions between insiders and outsiders. They prioritized the beliefs and ethical values of insiders as their obligations to one another, over any abstract notions of a unified human species, if such ideas were even acknowledged. Even the three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, upheld these distinctions between insiders and outsiders, despite their theoretical commitment to a single God governing all of humanity. So let's first examine the origins of modern universalist doctrines according to Wallerstein, then explore the roots of modern racism and sexism, and finally analyze the intersection of these two ideologies, considering both their causes and their consequences. For Wallerstein, there are two primary ways to explain the origins of universalism as an ideology within our current historical system. One perspective views universalism as the culmination of a long-standing intellectual tradition, while the other sees it as an ideology particularly suited to a capitalist world economy. These explanations are not necessarily contradictory. The argument for universalism as the outcome of a long-standing tradition is closely tied to three monotheistic religions. The key moral shift, it is argued, occurred when humans, or some of them at least, moved beyond belief in a tribal God to recognize the singularity of God, capital G God, and by extension the unity of humanity. However, this logic was only partially pursued by the monotheistic religions. Judaism maintained a special status for God's chosen people and was hesitant to expand membership through adoption. Christianity and Islam, on the other hand, removed such barriers by embracing proselytization. Nevertheless, both typically required an explicit act of allegiance, such as conversion by non-believers, to gain full access to the kingdom of God. Modern Enlightenment, though, it is said, took the monotheistic logic a step further, asserting that moral equality and human rights stem from human nature itself. There are several significant political and moral documents from the late 18th century that embody this Enlightenment ideology. These documents gained broad acceptance and influence largely due to major political upheavals, such as the French Revolution and the decolonization of the Americas. However, Wallerstein writes, there were many de facto omissions in these ideological documents of the 18th century, and most notably those of non-whites and women. Today, however, things are a bit different. Even movements that advocate racist or sexist policies often outwardly acknowledge universalism, such as Trump, for example, advocating for the deportation of 20 million people, but also denying the fact that he's racist. These movements suggest they find it unacceptable to reject it openly. This trend creates the impression of a continuous historical progression towards universalist ideology, leading some to argue that an inevitable world historical process is at play, what I was talking in the beginning of the video, making it seem like there is a trend towards universalism. The argument that universalism stems from the modern socio-economic framework is compelling. The capitalist world economy relies on endless capital accumulation driven by the commodification of everything, including goods, capital, and labor. Greater commodification depends on freer market flows, meaning any restriction on this process is seen as a hindrance. In other words, capitalism thrives on the ability to convert goods, capital, and labor into marketable commodities measured solely by their market value. And a commodity is anything that can be sold in the market, be it an item or labor. Anything that introduces non market criteria such as cultural, social, or ethical values, or prioritizes alternative valuations, hinders this process, making items less marketable. Therefore, capitalism necessitates a universalist ideology to ensure everything is reduced to a homogeneous, monetized commodity form. This process is described as a universal solvent, dissolving differences and transforming all social relations into measurable, market driven entities in the pursuit of endless capital accumulation and profit. This is argued to lead to two main outcomes. First, it claims to maximize efficiency in production by ensuring that most competent individuals are placed in roles best suited to their talents, as exemplified by the French Revolution's ideal of a quote unquote career open to talents. Second, it points to the development of institutional mechanisms such as state education systems, civil service structures, and anti nepotism rules, aimed at creating a meritocratic society. Additionally, it is claimed that meritocracy not only enhances economic efficiency, but also contributes to political stability. In historical capitalism, as in earlier systems, inequalities in the distribution of rewards exist. However, it is argued that resentment from those who receive fewer rewards towards those who receive more is less severe because the disparities are justified by merit rather than tradition. In other words, privilege earned through merit is seen as more morally and politically acceptable to most people than privilege gained through inheritance. This perception helps mitigate discontent and reinforces the legitimacy of the system. However, according to Wallerstein, this is dubious political sociology at best. While inherited privilege has historically been somewhat accepted by the oppressed due to mystical or fantastical beliefs in an unchanging order, offering them the solace of certainty, privilege based on being smarter or being educated is far harder to accept, except for those actively climbing the social ladder. Meritocracy, rather than being politically stable, is argued to be one of the least stable systems. Its inherent fragility creates fertile ground for the emergence of racism and sexism, as these ideologies provide alternative justifications for inequality in the face of meritocratic claims. In an expanding capitalist system, maximizing the accumulation of capital requires access to as much labor power as possible, as labor produces goods that generate more capital. Ejecting workers from the system is counterproductive. To optimize capital accumulation, two goals must be balanced: minimizing production cost, including labor cost, and reducing political disruption from the workforce. Racism serves as a magic formula that achieves this balance. It allows for the exploitation of labor at lower cost while simultaneously dividing and weakening potential worker protest, ensuring the system's stability and profitability. Racism has consistently blended assertions rooted in historical continuity, whether genetic or social, with a present-day focused adaptability in defining the precise boundaries of what we categorize as races or ethno-national religious groups. This duality allows racism to maintain a connection to the past while remaining flexible in shaping and reshaping the identities it targets today. As an example, we can look at the experiences of the Irish and Italian immigrants in America. In the early or even mid 20th century, experienced a lot of racism and discrimination, but now they're completely accepted as the mainstream. According to Wallerstein, however, there will always be a group at the bottom. In the US, for example, he says, had it not been for black people, another group would have taken their spot, even a group from Europe. Now, to sum up, racism, while consistent in its oppressive nature and adaptable in defining group boundaries, serves three key functions within capitalism. First, it enables the adjustment of the workforce available for the lowest paid, least desirable jobs based on current economic needs. Again, all the discourse about what happens if the migrants are deported from the US, who's going to do all the low level jobs, which is quite morally bankrupt because you see how liberals still are viewing these people as literal commodities. They're not saying what about their families and things like that. They're just worried about the economy. Second, racism fosters social communities that socialize individuals, including children, into accepting their assigned roles and inferiority, though this also inspires resistance. Third, and crucially, racism provides a non-meritocratic justification for inequality, allowing a significant portion of the workforce to be paid far less than merit would dictate. Now, if you look at a Western country as a whole, in a lot of cases, this may not seem like the case as we have minimum wage and things like that. But as we live in a globalized market economy, and as the majority of the commodities used in North America and Europe and the global North in general come from the global South, you can see that this is definitely the case that the commodities we use are built by almost slave like labor. This anti universalist aspect of racism is essential to maintaining capitalism, as it legitimizes systematic disparities that universalist ideologies like meritocracy cannot. Wallerstein says, but if capitalism as a system begets racism, does it need to beget sexism as well? Yes, because the two are in fact intimately linked. The ethnicization of the workforce enables the payment of very low wages to certain segments of workers, made possible because their households rely on non-wage income sources such as informal or unpaid labor to supplement their low earnings, predominantly done by women. This non-wage labor indirectly subsidizes employers by compensating for the inadequacy of wages. Sexism plays a similar role by devaluing and invisibilizing the labor of women, particularly in roles like housewives, whose work is dismissed as non-work. This allows capitalism to exploit their labor without compensation, as their contributions to surplus value are excluded from official labor force calculations. Ageism functions similarly, marginalizing the labor of the young and elderly. Together, racism, sexism, and ageism sustain a system where large segments of the workforce are underpaid or unpaid, or their work is not even acknowledged as actual work, enabling the continuous extraction of surplus value for capital owners. Silvia Federici, a prominent feminist scholar and activist, emphasizes in addition to the unpaid labor in the home, the critical role of women's unpaid reproductive labor in sustaining capitalist relations and system. This labor is essential for reproducing the workforce, both physically, as in raising children, and socially, as in maintaining workers' daily well-being. Federici highlights that this unpaid reproductive labor is systematically devalued and invisibilized under capitalism. By framing such work as quote-unquote natural or a labor of love, the system justifies not compensating women for their contributions. A country like US, for example, that is the richest country on earth, offers zero mandatory maternal leave after giving birth. This exploitation is rooted in patriarchal structures that actually predate capitalism, but were intensified and institutionalized with the rise of the capitalist economy. Federici connects this to the broader historical process of enclosures and the subjugation of women in early rise of capitalism, arguing that the control over women's bodies and labor was central to the developmental of capitalist accumulation. Federici highlights how both women's bodies and enslaved people's bodies were commodified and controlled to serve capitalist interests. Enslaved people were treated as property, bought and sold for their labor, while women's reproductive capacities were controlled to ensure the reproduction of the workforce. This dual exploitation of enslaved labor and women's unpaid reproductive labor was essential for the expansion of capitalism. This reduction of women's value to their ability to reproduce, while paradoxically ignoring the labor required for that ability, led to normalization of heterosexuality and stigmatization of homosexuality. In this context, as Federici says, lesbianism, especially when it rejects traditional family structures and male dependence, poses a threat to capitalist social organization and ensuring a stable labor force. For the same reason, eventually, later on in history, but eventually, homosexuality in men too was stigmatized. Thus, we can see how capitalism relies on two conflicting ideologies: universalism, meritocracy to justify the system for the middle class, and racism, sexism to control and exploit the majority of the workforce. While this combination is powerful and cohesive, it is inherently contradictory. The tension between these opposing ideologies creates instability as different groups push their respective logics too far, threatening to disrupt the system's delicate balance. Which brings us to the title of this video: what causes the trends of racism and sexism to go up and down? When racism and sexism are pushed to the extremes, such as in the Nazi genocide or apartheid systems, they become irrational and face resistance. This resistance comes not only from the victims but also from powerful economic forces. These forces oppose such extremes not because they reject racism itself, but because the primary goal of maintaining an ethnicized yet productive workforce is undermined by such radical measures. On the other hand, the consequences of pushing universalism to its extreme is where work roles and rewards are allocated purely based on equality, disregarding race or gender. Unlike the swift irrationality of extreme racism, achieving through universalism is a slow process requiring the dismantling of both legal barriers and deeply ingrained social patterns, which takes at least a generation. Resistance to this process is easy, as critics can accuse of efforts to eliminate racism and sexism of being reverse racism, using the language of universalism itself to undermine progress towards genuine equality. This type of language is something we hear in the language of the far right, in the language of Trump, in the language of Reform Party in the UK, and many other far right parties in Europe. So, we live in a capitalist system that balances universalism and racism sexism in a tense, unstable relationship. Efforts to push either ideology too far create a zigzag pattern of conflict, with both universalist and racist sexist tendencies growing stronger over time. This intensification is driven by historical experience and the system's inherent contradictions, including economic cycles of expansion and recession. As the system enters a structural crisis, the tension between universalism and racism sexism becomes a central ideological battleground. The challenge is not to determine which ideology will prevail, as they are inherently linked, but to create a new system that transcends both. This is why liberalism fails at its attempt at feminism and anti-racism. It doesn't address the underlying system that causes racism sexism. Instead, it opts to extend absolute universalism to a small minority of the population, celebrating a black president or a female CEO as a victory. Never mind the misogyny and racism they oversee. So the task to move beyond the current contradictions of the modern world system is a difficult one. But that is why it is necessary to dismantle capitalism before we can rid ourselves of the plague of racism and sexism, as well as homophobia. Thank you for listening to the first episode of the Solidarity Podcast. As I mentioned earlier, the aim of this podcast is to provide further analysis and social theoretical backing to the videos I post on my YouTube channel. If you're listening to this not on YouTube, please check out the YouTube channel at Solidarity Reports. And until next time, have a good day, or week, or month. I'm not sure how fast I'm going to be making these yet.